In the glittering halls of Fernley Manor, a dazzling emerald pendant vanishes during a grand charity auction, plunging the evening into scandal. Miss Jane Marple, with her unassuming charm and razor-sharp mind, steps into the shadows of suspicion. Was it the polished auctioneer, hiding nerves behind his cufflinks? The brash bidder, desperate to mask his fading fortune? The meticulous jeweler, whose secrets lie in his notebook? Or the quiet guest, her crimson gown concealing a painful past? As clues unravel, a faint scratch, a spilled flute, a hidden key, Miss Marple weaves a web of truth, exposing a cunning plot of deception and greed. In just one night, she'll uncover the thief and restore the jewel's shine. Dive into this classic mystery, where nothing is as it seems. Chapter 1. The Charity Auction. The grand hall of Fernley Manor shimmered with an air of festivity, its high ceilings adorned with crystal chandeliers that cast prisms of light across the polished oak floor. The occasion was Lady Harrington's annual charity auction, a much-anticipated event in the county, drawing a motley assembly of local gentry, wealthy newcomers, and curious onlookers, all united by the promise of philanthropy and the allure of rare treasures. The proceeds, as Lady Harrington had proudly announced in her invitations, would fund a new wing for the village hospital, a cause that lent the evening a veneer of noble purpose. Yet, as Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in a cushioned chair near the back of the hall, her knitting needles clicking softly, she sensed an undercurrent of something less altruistic, a subtle tension that rippled through the crowd like a breeze stirring leaves. Miss Marple, with her unassuming demeanor and sharp, bird-like eyes, had not come to Fernley Manor for the auction itself. She was here at the insistence of Lady Harrington, an old-school friend whose effusive letters had finally persuaded her to leave the quiet comforts of St. Mary Mead. "You simply must come, Jane," Lady Harrington had written. "Your knack for seeing through people would liven up our dull little gathering." Miss Marple, ever skeptical of flattery but curious about human nature, had agreed, packing her best lace shawl and a healthy dose of skepticism. Now, as she surveyed the room, she noted the familiar patterns of vanity, ambition, and secrecy that seemed to follow wealth like shadows. At the heart of the evening's excitement stood a raised platform, where a velvet-lined case held the auction's pièce de résistance, an emerald pendant of exquisite beauty. The gem, a deep, verdant green, seemed to pulse with life under the chandelier's glow, its facets catching the light in a way that drew gasps from the crowd. It was flanked by lesser lots, silver candelabras, a set of porcelain figurines, but none commanded attention like the pendant. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on it, not for its beauty, but for the way it seemed to draw out the true characters of those around it. Mr. Clarence Vane, the auctioneer, presided over the proceedings with the practiced charm of a man accustomed to commanding rooms. His voice, smooth as polished mahogany, carried over the hum of conversation as he described the pendant's provenance. "A singular creation, ladies and gentlemen, crafted by the esteemed jeweler Mr. Felix Mortimer, who has graciously donated it for our cause," he said, gesturing toward a wiry man seated in the front row. Mr. Mortimer, with his angular face and meticulously tailored suit, inclined his head in acknowledgement, though his expression remained guarded, as if he were weighing the value of his own generosity. Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his lips, a detail that might mean nothing, or everything. Among the bidders, Mr. Roland Baxter stood out, his broad shoulders and booming laugh marking him as a man who relished attention. A self-made industrialist, his fortune was rumored to be vast but precarious, his factories struggling against modern competition. He leaned forward in his seat, his eyes fixed on the pendant with a hunger that Miss Marple found intriguing. Was it the gem's beauty that captivated him, or the status it might confer? Beside him sat a young woman in a crimson gown, Miss Clara Henshaw, whose presence seemed to puzzle the older guests. Introduced as a distant cousin of Lady Harrington, she carried herself with a quiet grace, but her eyes, wide and watchful, darted about the room as if searching for something or someone. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. The young woman's poise was admirable, but there was a brittleness to it, like porcelain on the verge of cracking. As Mr. Vane opened the bidding, the atmosphere shifted from polite interest to fevered competition. The pendant's price climbed swiftly, driven by Mr. Baxter's bold bids, each one punctuated by a triumphant nod. Other bidders faltered, their hesitations no match for his determination. At last, with a final bid that drew a collective intake of breath, Mr. Baxter secured the pendant, and the room erupted in applause. Mr. Vane, with a flourish, locked the pendant in its case, the click of the mechanism audible in the sudden hush. He handed the key to a steward, a lanky young man named Thomas, who stood rigidly by the display table, his face pale with the weight of responsibility. Miss Marple watched as the case was placed on a side table, its position carefully chosen to be both visible and secure. Lady Harrington, resplendent in sapphire silk, swept past, pausing to exchange a few words with her guests. She caught Miss Marple's eye and smiled warmly. "Jane, isn't it splendid? The hospital will be transformed." Miss Marple returned the smile, her thoughts elsewhere. The pendant, the bidders, the auctioneer, each played a role in a scene that felt curiously staged. She recalled a similar auction in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen brooch had revealed the greed beneath a village's polite veneer. Here, too, she sensed a discord, a note out of tune in the evening's harmony. As the guests began to drift toward the drawing room for champagne, Miss Marple remained near the back, her knitting resumed, but her mind alert. The pendant, locked away, seemed safe, yet she could not shake the feeling that safety was an illusion. People, she knew, were rarely as careful as they believed themselves to be, and secrets, like emeralds, had a way of catching the light when least expected. Chapter 2. The Vanishing. The grand hall of Fernley Manor, so recently alive with the fervor of bidding, had softened into a gentler hum as the charity auction drew to a close. The chandeliers still cast their radiant glow, but the energy of the room had shifted from anticipation to satisfaction, the guests now basking in the afterglow of their contributions to the village hospital. Laughter and the clink of champagne flutes drifted from the drawing room, where Lady Harrington presided over her guests with the grace of a seasoned hostess. Miss Jane Marple, however, lingered in the hall, her knitting bag tucked beside her chair, her eyes flitting over the crowd with the quiet alertness of a sparrow. She had no taste for champagne, preferring the clarity of observation to the haze of festivity. The emerald pendant, now locked in its velvet-lined case on a side table, seemed to hold the room's secrets in its deep green facets, and Miss Marple sensed that those secrets were about to unravel. The side table, draped in white linen and positioned near a heavy damask curtain, was under the nominal guard of Thomas, the young steward, whose lanky frame and nervous demeanor suggested he was ill-suited to such responsibility. Miss Marple noted his frequent glances toward the drawing room as if longing to join the revelry. The case itself, a handsome piece of polished mahogany with a brass lock, gleamed under the light, its contents the subject of whispered admiration among the guests. Mr. Roland Baxter, the triumphant bidder, had already boasted to a small circle of admirers about his plans to present the pendant to his wife, though Miss Marple wondered if his motives were as sentimental as he claimed. Mr. Clarence Vane, the auctioneer, had retreated to a corner, mopping his brow with a silk handkerchief, his earlier polish slightly tarnished by the evening's exertions. Mr. Felix Mortimer, the jeweler, stood apart, his sharp eyes scanning the room, while Miss Clara Henshaw, in her striking crimson gown, moved through the crowd with a curious blend of reticence and purpose. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, sharp cry that cut through the murmur of conversation. It came from Thomas, who stood frozen by the side table, his hands hovering over the open case as if afraid to touch it. "It's gone," he stammered, his voice cracking with panic. The words seemed to hang in the air, drawing every eye to the table. A hush fell over the hall, followed by a ripple of gasps and murmurs as guests craned their necks to see. Miss Marple rose quietly, her knitting abandoned, and made her way toward the table, her small figure slipping unnoticed through the gathering crowd. Lady Harrington, alerted by the commotion, swept into the hall, her sapphire gown catching the light as she moved. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of indignation and alarm. Thomas, his face ashen, gestured helplessly at the case. "The pendant, ma'am. It's not here. I swear I only stepped away for a moment." His words tumbled out in a rush, and Miss Marple noted the beads of sweat on his forehead, the way his hands twisted together as if trying to wring out his guilt. Mr. Vane pushed through the crowd, his composure fraying at the edges. "Impossible," he declared, seizing the case and inspecting it with a theatrical flourish. "I locked it myself. See, the mechanism is intact." He held up a small brass key, its surface glinting as if to corroborate his claim. Yet the case, when opened, revealed only the empty velvet interior, its rich blue lining mocking the absence of the emerald. Mr. Felix Mortimer joined them, his movements precise and deliberate as he examined the lock. "No signs of tampering," he said, his voice low but authoritative. "The thief must have had a key." His words carried a hint of accusation, and Thomas flinched as if struck. Mr. Roland Baxter, his face flushed with anger, elbowed his way to the table. "This is an outrage," he bellowed, his voice carrying the weight of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I paid a king's ransom for that pendant, and now you tell me it's vanished? I demand an explanation." His eyes darted from Mr. Vane to Thomas, then to Mr. Mortimer, as if seeking a culprit among them. Miss Clara Henshaw, standing at the edge of the circle, watched the scene, with an expression that Miss Marple found difficult to decipher, a blend of curiosity and something deeper, perhaps fear or calculation. Lady Harrington, her face pale beneath her rouge, turned to the assembled guests. "Please, everyone, remain calm," she said, though her voice betrayed her unease. "There must be some mistake. We shall search the hall at once." She gestured to the butler, a dour man named Hawkins, who began organizing the footmen to check the exits. The guests, however, showed no inclination to disperse, their curiosity outweighing their decorum. Whispers of theft and scandal began to circulate, and Miss Marple, standing quietly by the curtain, felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle taking shape. She approached Lady Harrington, her voice soft, but carrying the weight of experience. "My dear, might I suggest we avoid a public spectacle? A discreet inquiry may serve us better than a general alarm." Lady Harrington, who had heard tales of Miss Marple's quiet genius in unraveling village mysteries, seized the suggestion with relief. "Oh, Jane, would you? I'd be ever so grateful. This is simply dreadful." Miss Marple inclined her head, her eyes twinkling with the prospect of a challenge. "I shall do my best," she said simply, though her mind was already racing through possibilities. She began by observing the scene more closely, her gaze lingering on the empty case. The lock, as Mr. Mortimer had noted, showed no signs of force, suggesting either a duplicate key or an extraordinary sleight of hand. The table's position near the curtained alcove offered a thief a moment of concealment, but the act would have required precision and nerve. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the key players. Mr. Vane, whose polished exterior might hide a less savory motive. Mr. Baxter, whose financial troubles could make the pendant's value tempting. Mr. Mortimer, whose expertise with jewels gave him both opportunity and means. And Miss Henshaw, whose quiet demeanor seemed to mask a deeper story. Thomas, too, could not be dismissed, though his panic seemed genuine. Miss Marple approached Thomas first, finding him slumped in a chair near the table, his hands still trembling. "Now, my dear boy," she said gently, her tone that of a kindly aunt, "tell me exactly what happened." Thomas swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously. "I was watching the case, ma'am, just as Mr. Vane told me. But a lady asked for a glass of water. She said she felt faint. I only stepped away for a minute, to the refreshment table over there." He pointed to a table some 20 feet away, partially obscured by the crowd. "When I came back, I checked the case, and it was empty." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And this lady, who was she?" Thomas hesitated, his cheeks reddening. "It was Miss Henshaw, ma'am, the one in the red dress." The admission piqued Miss Marple's interest. Miss Henshaw's request, timed so conveniently, suggested either coincidence or design. "And did you see anyone near the case while you were gone?" she asked. Thomas shook his head vigorously. "No, ma'am. It was only a moment, I swear." His earnestness was convincing, but Miss Marple knew that panic could mask guilt as easily as innocence. She turned her attention to the crowd, noting their positions. Mr. Baxter had returned to his circle of admirers, his bluster undiminished as he recounted his outrage. Mr. Vane was speaking in low tones to Lady Harrington, his gestures emphatic, while Mr. Mortimer stood alone, his fingers tracing the edge of a cigarette case as if lost in thought. Miss Henshaw had vanished into the drawing room, her absence as conspicuous as her earlier presence. Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with her next, sensing that the young woman's story held a key to the mystery. She approached the side table once more, her small figure dwarfed by the looming figures of the footmen now guarding it. The curtained alcove caught her eye, its heavy folds offering a perfect hiding place for a swift-handed thief. She parted the curtain slightly, peering into the shadowed space beyond. It was empty, save for a small stool and a discarded champagne flute, its contents spilled on the floor. The spill was fresh, the liquid still glistening, and Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully. Someone had been here, perhaps in haste, and the flute's presence suggested a guest rather than a servant. She returned to the case, studying its interior. The velvet lining was pristine, save for a faint indentation where the pendant had rested. There were no scratches, no signs of forced entry, only the smooth precision of a lock expertly opened. Miss Marple's mind flashed to a similar incident in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen locket had been taken not by force, but by cunning, the thief using a moment of distraction to swap keys. Here, too, the theft seemed calculated, the work of someone who knew the case's design and the auction's rhythm. Lady Harrington rejoined her, her face drawn with worry. "Jane, have you found anything?" she asked, her voice low to avoid the ears of nearby guests. Miss Marple smiled reassuringly. "Only the beginnings of an idea," she said, "but I shall need to speak with a few people, Mr. Vane, Mr. Baxter, Mr. Mortimer, and Miss Henshaw, for a start, and perhaps young Thomas again, when he's calmer." Lady Harrington nodded, her trust in Miss Marple absolute. "Whatever you need, Jane. Only please, let it be resolved quickly. The scandal could ruin the hospital's campaign." Miss Marple patted her friend's hand. "We shall do our best to avoid that," she said, though her thoughts were already elsewhere, piecing together the fragments of the evening. The pendant's disappearance was no mere act of opportunism. It was a performance, staged with care and executed with precision. The question was not only who had taken it, but why, and what they hoped to gain by leaving an empty case in its place. As the guests continued their murmured speculations, Miss Marple slipped into the drawing room, her eyes seeking Miss Henshaw's crimson gown. The young woman stood by a window, her silhouette framed against the moonlit gardens, her posture tense. Miss Marple approached, her steps soft but deliberate. "Miss Henshaw," she said, her voice warm but probing, "might I have a word?" The young woman turned, her expression guarded, and Miss Marple knew at once that the conversation would be revealing, if not in words, then in the silences between them. The evening had taken a sharp turn, and Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of curiosity, tempered by caution. People, she knew, were like the patterns in her knitting, simple on the surface, but prone to tangles when closely examined. The emerald pendant was gone, but its absence had left a trail, and Miss Marple intended to follow it, stitch by careful stitch, until the truth was laid bare. Chapter 3. The Auctioneer's Tale. The library of Fernley Manor, with its towering bookshelves and the soft glow of a fire in the hearth, provided a haven of calm amidst the storm of whispers that had swept through the grand hall. The emerald pendant's disappearance had cast a pall over Lady Harrington's charity auction, and the guests, now gathered in clusters, traded theories in hushed tones. Miss Jane Marple, however, had sought the solitude of the library to begin her inquiries. Her small figure settled comfortably in a cushioned armchair, her knitting bag at her side like a faithful companion. Across from her sat Mr. Clarence Vane, the auctioneer, whose polished demeanor seemed to fray at the edges, his hands betraying a nervous energy as he adjusted his cufflinks and clutched a silk handkerchief. The firelight played across his face, revealing a man caught between indignation and unease, and Miss Marple's keen eyes missed none of it. Mr. Vane was a striking figure, his dark hair slicked back with precision, his suit tailored to perfection, yet there was a brittleness to his composure, as if the evening's calamity threatened to unravel the persona he had so carefully constructed. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice striving for its usual sonorous confidence, but tinged with strain. "I am at a loss. The pendant was under my care, locked in its case. I cannot imagine how it was taken." His words were delivered with the cadence of a man accustomed to swaying crowds, yet Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his fingers, the way his gaze darted toward the door as if anticipating rescue or exposure. She adjusted her lace shawl, her movements deliberate, her smile serene yet probing. "Mr. Vane, you must not let this trouble you unduly," she said, her tone warm, as if coaxing a reluctant confidant. "But do tell me, step by step, how the pendant was handled. You presented it during the auction, I believe?" Her question was gentle, but her eyes, bright as a sparrow's, held a quiet intensity that seemed to unsettle him further. He nodded, eager to assert his diligence. "Precisely so. I took the pendant from its case to display it to the bidders, holding it aloft so the light could catch its facets. It was a magnificent piece, and I ensured it was seen to full effect. Once Mr. Baxter's bid was confirmed, I placed it back in the case, locked it with the key, and entrusted both to Thomas, the steward. I assure you, the case was never out of my sight until that moment." His voice carried a note of indignation, but Miss Marple observed the way. He twisted his handkerchief, a gesture that spoke of more than mere frustration. "And the key?" she asked, her voice soft but pointed. "You kept it with you until you gave it to Thomas?" The question hung in the air, and she watched as a flicker of hesitation crossed his face, brief but telling. "Yes, of course," he replied, his tone a shade too quick. "It was in my pocket until I handed it over. No one could have taken it." He met her gaze, but his eyes slid away, settling on the fire as if seeking refuge in its glow. Miss Marple made a mental note of his discomfort, filing it away like a stitch in a pattern yet to be completed. She leaned back, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "You have been most thorough, Mr. Vane. Tell me, how long have you been in the auctioneering trade? It must require a great deal of trust." Her tone was conversational, but the question was a probe, designed to draw out the man behind the polished exterior. Mr. Vane straightened, seizing the opportunity to shift the focus. "Nearly 20 years, he said, a hint of pride creeping into his voice. "I began as an apprentice in a small London firm, working my way up through diligence and charm. It's a trade that demands both, knowing the value of a piece and the art of persuading others to see it. I've handled items far grander than this pendant, and never once has there been a mishap." His words were firm, but Miss Marple detected a defensive edge, as if he felt the need to bolster his reputation against an unspoken accusation. "And yet," she said mildly, "this mishap has occurred. A curious thing, is it not, that a locked case should yield its treasure so easily?" She paused, letting the silence press upon him. Mr. Vane's jaw tightened, and he adjusted his cufflinks once more, a gesture Miss Marple now recognized as a nervous tic. "I can only repeat, Miss Marple, that I locked the case myself. If there was a lapse, it was not mine." His voice rose slightly, and he leaned forward, as if to impress his sincerity upon her. "I have too much at stake, my name, my standing. A man in my position does not risk such a scandal." His words were vehement, but Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to a village auction in St. Mary Mead, where a trusted clerk had protested his innocence with similar fervor, only to be undone by a single, careless detail. She wondered what detail Mr. Vane might have overlooked. She shifted the conversation, her tone as light as if discussing the weather. You must know many in the trade, Mr. Vane. Have you worked with Mr. Mortimer before? He seems a meticulous man." The question was casual, but she watched for his reaction, curious about the relationship between the auctioneer and the jeweler who had crafted the pendant. Mr. Vane's expression softened, as if relieved to move away from his own role. "Felix? Oh yes, we've collaborated on several occasions. He's a fine craftsman, though a touch particular about his work. He insisted on overseeing the pendant's display himself, you know, to ensure it was presented properly. I found it a bit fussy, but he's always been that way." His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple noted the faint edge of irritation, as if Mr. Mortimer's involvement had rankled him. "Indeed," she said, her eyebrows lifting slightly. "He must take great pride in his creations. Did he handle the case at all, before or after the auction?" Her question was innocent enough, but she saw Mr. Vane's fingers pause on his cufflinks, his gaze sharpening. "Not that I recall," he said carefully. "He inspected the pendant earlier in the day to ensure it was secure, but during the auction it was my responsibility. Why do you ask?" His voice held a note of curiosity, but Miss Marple sensed a wariness beneath it, as if he feared where her questions might lead. "Oh, merely trying to understand the sequence of events," she said airily, waving a hand as if to dismiss any suspicion. "It's often the smallest details that clarify matters. For instance, where was the case kept before the auction began?" She leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest. Mr. Vane hesitated, then answered with a touch of reluctance. "In Lady Harrington's study, under lock and key. I fetched it myself just before the auction started. Mr. Mortimer was there earlier, as I said, to check the setting, but I saw to its transfer to the hall." His words were measured, but Miss Marple noted the slight emphasis on his own role, as if to distance himself from any oversight. She nodded, her smile unwavering. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Vane. I'm sure we shall sort this out in no time." Her tone was reassuring, but her mind was already weaving a pattern from the threads he had provided. The locked case, the single key, the brief moment of Thomas's absence. It all pointed to a theft requiring both opportunity and expertise. Mr. Vane's insistence on his own diligence was convincing, yet his nervous gestures suggested a man who feared scrutiny, whether for guilt or merely the stain of failure. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple paused by the door, turning back with a thoughtful air. "One last thing, Mr. Vane. Did you notice anyone lingering near the case during the auction? Perhaps someone who seemed out of place?" Her question was almost an afterthought, but she watched him closely, alert for any flicker of recognition. He shook his head, his expression firm. "No one, Miss Marple. The hall was crowded, but I was focused on the bidding. If anyone approached the case, it would have been Thomas's duty to notice." His words were crisp, deflecting responsibility, and Miss Marple smiled faintly, sensing the subtle shift of blame. "Thank you, Mr. Vane," she said, her voice warm. "You've given me much to consider." She stepped into the corridor, her small figure swallowed by the shadows of Fernley Manor, her mind alight with possibilities. Mr. Vane's account was thorough, yet it left gaps, moments unaccounted for, glances unacknowledged. She recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead, where a trusted figure's overconfidence had masked a critical lapse. Mr. Vane's pride in his reputation was a shield, but whether it concealed guilt or mere embarrassment, she could not yet say. Her thoughts turned to the other players. Mr. Baxter, whose financial straits might tempt him to desperate measures, Mr. Mortimer, whose expertise with jewels made him a figure of interest, Miss Henshaw, whose quiet presence seemed to hide a deeper story, and young Thomas, whose panic might be genuine or a performance. The library's quiet had given her clarity, but the puzzle was far from solved. As she made her way back to the drawing room, where the guests' whispers had grown into a low roar, Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of anticipation. The emerald pendant was gone, but its absence had left a trail of clues, and she would follow them with the patience of a knitter unraveling a tangled skein. Chapter 4. The Bidder's Motive. The conservatory of Fernley Manor, with its glass walls and lush profusion of ferns and orchids, offered a stark contrast to the library's somber oak and leather. Moonlight filtered through the panes, casting dappled shadows across the tiled floor, where Miss Jane Marple now stood, her small figure dwarfed by the towering plants. The air was heavy with the scent of earth and blooms, a humid warmth that seemed to amplify the tension of the evening. Mr. Roland Baxter, the industrialist who had won the emerald pendant at auction, paced the length of the room like a restless beast, his broad shoulders hunched and his face flushed with indignation. Miss Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, observed him with her usual quiet attentiveness, her eyes sharp beneath the soft brim of her hat. The pendant's disappearance had stirred a tempest in Mr. Baxter, and she intended to discover whether his anger stemmed from loss, guilt, or something else entirely. Mr. Baxter's heavy footsteps echoed against the tiles as he turned to face her, his voice booming in the enclosed space. "Miss Marple, this is an absolute outrage," he declared, his hands clenched into fists. "I paid a fortune for that pendant, more than it was worth, if I'm honest, and now it's gone, vanished like smoke. I demand to know who's responsible." His bluster filled the room, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted toward the door, as if he feared being overheard, or perhaps seen. She settled onto a wicker chair, her movements slow and deliberate, her smile as gentle as a summer breeze. "Mr. Baxter, you mustn't let this upset you so," she said, her voice soothing yet laced with a quiet authority. "I'm sure we shall get to the bottom of it, but tell me, why were you so determined to have the pendant? It was a generous bid, to be sure." Her question was posed with the mild curiosity of a village gossip, but her gaze was steady, probing for the truth beneath his bravado. Mr. Baxter stopped pacing, his expression softening into a mix of pride and defensiveness. "It was for my wife, Eleanor," he said, his tone softening momentarily. "She's always had a fondness for emeralds, and I thought it would make a fine gift. Besides, a man in my position can't be seen stinting at a charity auction. It's expected, you know. Sets the tone." He puffed out his chest, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in his eyes, as if the mention of his position carried a weight he preferred not to acknowledge. She nodded, her hands resting lightly on her knitting bag. A thoughtful gesture indeed, and yet such a substantial sum. "Forgive me, but I've heard whispers that your factories have faced challenges lately. Was the pendant's cost no burden?" Her question was delicate, but it landed like a stone in still water, and she watched the ripples spread across his face. Mr. Baxter's jaw tightened, and he resumed pacing, his steps sharper now. "Gossip travels fast, doesn't it?" he said, his voice edged with irritation. "Yes, the factories have had a rough patch, new competitors, rising costs, but I'm not destitute, Miss Marple. I can afford a trinket like that pendant, and I'll not have anyone say otherwise." His words were forceful, but Miss Marple noted the way. His hands clenched and unclenched, a sign of a man whose confidence was more show than substance. She tilted her head, her expression one of sympathetic interest. "Of course, Mr. Baxter, no one doubts your standing. But during the auction, did you notice anything unusual? Anyone near the case, perhaps, or any moment when it might have been left unattended?" Her question shifted the focus, giving him an opportunity to redirect his energy, and she watched as he seized it with relief. He paused, rubbing his chin as if summoning a memory. "Nothing out of the ordinary," he said, his tone more measured. "I was focused on the bidding, you see. Had to keep an eye on that young fellow who kept raising me, some upstart from London. But the case was there, on the table, with that steward boy hovering about. I didn't see anyone tampering with it." His eyes flicked toward the glass wall, where the moonlit gardens stretched into darkness, and Miss Marple wondered if he was recalling something he chose not to share. "Thomas, you mean?" she prompted gently. "He stepped away briefly, I understand, to fetch water for a guest. Did you see him leave?" Her question was casual, but she leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on his face. Mr. Baxter frowned, his brow furrowing. "Can't say I did. I was too busy celebrating my win, shaking hands, that sort of thing. But I suppose he must have, if that's when the thing went missing." His voice carried a hint of dismissal, as if the steward's actions were beneath his notice. But Miss Marple sensed a calculated vagueness in his response. She shifted tack, her tone as light as ever. "You must have been pleased to secure the pendant. Did you have a chance to examine it closely after the auction, before it was locked away?" Her question was another probe, designed to test his familiarity with the pendant and its case. He shook his head, his expression darkening. "No, I didn't. Vane whisked it back into the case the moment the gavel fell, said it was protocol, to keep it secure until payment was finalized. I thought it a bit high-handed, but I didn't argue." His resentment was palpable, and Miss Marple noted it, wondering if his frustration with Mr. Vane might hint at a deeper grievance. "And Mr. Mortimer, the jeweler," she said, her voice musing. "You must know him as a man of means with an interest in fine things. Did you discuss the pendant with him before the auction?" Her question was a gentle nudge, seeking to uncover any connection that might illuminate the theft. Mr. Baxter snorted, his irritation shifting to the jeweler. "Mortimer? Barely. He's a cold fish, that one. I tried to talk to him about the pendant's craftsmanship, thought it might impress Eleanor to know its history, but he brushed me off, said he was too busy preparing it for display. Didn't strike me as the generous type, donating it for charity." His words carried a note of disdain, and Miss Marple filed it away, intrigued by the tension between the bidder and the jeweler. She leaned back, her hands smoothing the folds of her skirt. "You've been most forthcoming, Mr. Baxter. It's a puzzling matter, isn't it? A locked case, a single key, and yet the pendant is gone." She paused, letting the weight of the mystery settle between them. "Did you happen to notice Miss Henshaw, the young lady in the crimson gown? She was near the table at one point, I believe." Her question was almost an afterthought, but she watched his reaction closely, alert for any sign of recognition. Mr. Baxter's eyes narrowed, and he hesitated, as if weighing his response. "The Henshaw girl? Yes, I saw her hovering about, looking out of place, kept to herself mostly, but I caught her staring at the pendant during the auction. Probably wished she could afford it." His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple noted the brief flicker in his eyes, as if he had seen more than he was willing to admit. She smiled, her expression one of mild gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Baxter. You've given me much to think about." She rose, her small figure moving with a grace that belied her age, and made her way toward the conservatory door. Mr. Baxter resumed his pacing, his anger simmering but no longer directed at her. As she stepped into the corridor, the cool air a relief after the conservatory's humidity, Miss Marple's mind was already at work, piecing together the fragments of Mr. Baxter's account. His bluster, she reflected, was a shield, concealing a man whose fortunes were less secure than he wished to appear. His eagerness to win the pendant suggested a desire to project wealth, but his financial straits raised the possibility of a more desperate motive, perhaps a scheme to claim the pendant's value without paying for it. Yet his ignorance of the case's handling and his focus on the bidding seemed genuine, and his resentment toward Mr. Vane and Mr. Mortimer hinted at rivalries that might bear fruit. Miss Henshaw's presence near the table, as he had noted, was a detail worth exploring, particularly given Thomas's claim that she had summoned him away. Miss Marple recalled a similar incident in St. Mary Mead, where a wealthy farmer had protested his innocence in a theft with similar vehemence, only to be undone by a single inconsistency in his story. Mr. Baxter's account was plausible, but his evasiveness about Miss Henshaw and his reluctance to admit any lapse in observation suggested he was holding something back. Whether it was guilt, fear, or simply pride, she could not yet say, but the pattern was beginning to take shape. As she made her way back to the drawing room, where the guests' murmurs had grown into a restless hum, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle unfolding. The emerald pendant was more than a stolen jewel. It was a mirror, reflecting the ambitions and secrets of those who coveted it. Mr. Baxter had played his part, but the stage was crowded, and Miss Marple knew that her next conversation with the enigmatic Mr. Mortimer would add another thread to the intricate tapestry she was weaving. Chapter 5. The Jeweler's Craft. The study of Fernley Manor, with its dark paneled walls and heavy velvet drapes, exuded an air of somber authority, as if the room itself held secrets in its shadowed corners. A single lamp cast a pool of light on the mahogany desk where Mr. Felix Mortimer sat, his wiry frame rigid with a tension that belied his outward calm. His sharp features, framed by neatly combed hair and a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles, gave him the appearance of a man who missed nothing. Yet Miss Jane Marple, seated across from him, sensed a guardedness that spoke of more than professional pride. Her knitting bag rested at her feet, a quiet companion to her unassuming presence, but her eyes, bright and piercing, studied the jeweler with the precision of a needle threading a delicate stitch. The emerald pendant's disappearance had cast suspicion on all who had touched it, and Mr. Mortimer, as its creator, was a figure of particular interest. The study's silence was broken only by the faint tick of a grandfather clock in the corner, its rhythm a steady counterpoint to Mr. Mortimer's restless fingers, which drummed lightly on the armrest of his chair. Miss Marple, her lace shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, offered a smile that was both disarming and deliberate. "Mr. Mortimer," she began, her voice soft as a whisper in a confessional, "you must be terribly distressed by the loss of your beautiful pendant. Such a fine piece of work, and so generously donated for the hospital. Her words were laced with admiration, but her gaze was unwavering, searching for the flicker of truth beneath his polished exterior. Mr. Mortimer inclined his head, his expression one of practiced modesty. "It is a blow, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low and precise, each word chosen with care. The pendant was a labor of love, crafted over months to capture the emerald's natural brilliance. To see it stolen is disheartening, to say the least. His fingers paused their drumming, and he adjusted his spectacles, a gesture that Miss Marple noted as a shield against scrutiny. She leaned forward slightly, her hands folded in her lap. "You are too modest, Mr. Mortimer. I've heard you're a master of your craft, with a reputation for perfection. Tell me, how did you come to create such a piece, and why part with it for the auction?" Her question was gentle, but it carried a subtle challenge, inviting him to reveal more than he might intend. Mr. Mortimer's lips twitched, as if weighing the merits of candor. "The emerald came from a reputable dealer in Amsterdam," he said, his tone measured. "A rare stone, flawless in its depth of color. I designed the setting myself, white gold, with a delicate filigree to complement the gem's fire. As for donating it, Lady Harrington is a valued client, and her cause was worthy. I thought it a fitting gesture." His words were smooth, but Miss Marple caught the faintest note of reluctance, as if the act of giving had been less voluntary than he claimed. She nodded, her expression one of polite interest. "A noble gesture indeed, and the case, such a handsome piece. Did you design that as well?" Her question was casual, but her eyes sharpened, recalling the locked case and its empty velvet interior, a puzzle that pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of its workings. Mr. Mortimer's fingers resumed their drumming, a faint rhythm that betrayed his calm. "The case? Yes, I provided it. A custom piece designed to protect the pendant and display it securely. I ensured it was fitted with a reliable lock, nothing extravagant, but sufficient for the purpose." His voice was even, but Miss Marple noted the way. His gaze flicked to the desk, where a leather-bound notebook lay, its pages filled with sketches she had glimpsed earlier. "And you inspected the pendant before the auction, I believe?" she asked, her tone as light as if discussing a neighbor's garden. "To ensure it was properly presented, no doubt." She watched him closely, alert for any sign of unease. He nodded, his expression unchanging. "I did. I checked the setting that morning to confirm it was secure. A jeweler's habit, you understand, ensuring one's work is flawless." His words were plausible, but Miss Marple sensed a rehearsed quality, as if he had anticipated the question and prepared his response. She shifted tack, her voice musing. "It's curious, isn't it, how a locked case could be opened without a trace? The lock showed no signs of tampering, Mr. Vane assures me. You must know a great deal about such mechanisms, being in the trade." Her comment was almost idle, but it landed with the precision of a dart, and she saw a fleeting shadow cross Mr. Mortimer's face. "I know enough," he said, his tone clipped. "But I had no hand in the theft, if that's what you're implying. My reputation rests on trust, Miss Marple. I'd hardly risk it for a single jewel, no matter its value." His voice rose slightly, and he leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers with a challenge of their own. Miss Marple smiled, unruffled, her mind noting the defensiveness that had crept into his manner. "Of course," she said soothingly. "No one doubts your integrity. But tell me, Did you notice anyone near the case during the auction? Perhaps someone who seemed overly curious? Her question was another probe, designed to test his observations and his willingness to share them. Mr. Mortimer hesitated, his fingers pausing on the armrest. "The hall was crowded," he said at last. "I was seated near the front, watching the bidding. I saw Mr. Baxter, of course, making a spectacle of himself, and that young woman, Miss Henshaw, I believe, standing near the side table at one point. But nothing struck me as unusual." His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple caught the way his eyes lingered on the notebook, as if it held answers he was reluctant to voice. She followed his gaze, her curiosity piqued. "Your sketches must be fascinating," she said, her voice bright with interest. "I glimpsed them earlier, such intricate designs. Do you often keep such detailed records?" Her question was innocent, but she watched as his hand moved instinctively toward the notebook, as if to shield it. "A habit of the trade," he said, his voice regaining its precision. "I sketch every piece, note its materials, its construction. It's a record of my work, nothing more." His words were firm, but Miss Marple sensed a guardedness, as if the notebook held more than mere sketches. She rose, her movements slow and deliberate, her smile unwavering. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Mortimer. I'm sure we shall resolve this matter soon." She paused by the desk, her eyes resting briefly on the notebook. "Might I trouble you to see one of your sketches? Just to admire your artistry, of course." Her request was made with the air of a curious amateur, but she saw the flicker of alarm in his eyes. He hesitated, then opened the notebook, flipping to a page with a detailed drawing of a pendant. Not the emerald, but a sapphire piece, its lines meticulous. "This is typical of my work," he said, his voice tight. "The emerald pendant was similar, but I haven't the sketch to hand." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes lingering on the page, noting the precision of the lines and the faint smudge of ink, as if a page had been hastily turned. "Thank you, Mr. Mortimer," she said, her tone warm. "You've given me much to consider." She moved toward the door, her small figure silhouetted against the lamplight, her mind alight with new threads to weave into her pattern. Mr. Mortimer's expertise, his access to the case, and his guarded demeanor made him a compelling figure in the mystery. The notebook, she suspected, held more than he had revealed, and she resolved to examine it further, with Lady Harrington's discreet assistance. As she stepped into the corridor, the murmur of the drawing-room reached her, a reminder of the restless curiosity among the guests. Mr. Mortimer's account was polished, like the jewels he crafted, but it lacked the warmth of truth. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a silversmith's meticulous records had betrayed his involvement in a theft, his obsession with detail proving his undoing. Mr. Mortimer's precision was a strength, but it might also be a weakness, and Miss Marple intended to test it. Her thoughts turned to Miss Henshaw, whose presence near the case had been noted by both Mr. Baxter and Mr. Mortimer. The young woman's quiet demeanor and her curious request for water suggested a role in the evening's drama, whether as pawn or player. Miss Marple made her way toward the drawing-room, her steps soft but purposeful, her mind already anticipating the next conversation. The emerald pendant was a missing piece in a larger puzzle, and she was determined to find where it fit, guided by the subtle clues that others overlooked. Chapter 6. The Guest's Secret. The gardens of Fernley Manor stretched out under a silvered moon, their neatly trimmed hedges and rose beds bathed in a soft, ethereal glow. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine, a welcome contrast to the stifling warmth of the manor's crowded rooms. Miss Jane Marple, her lace shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders, stepped onto the gravel path, her small figure moving with a quiet purpose. The hum of conversation from the drawing room faded behind her, replaced by the distant chirp of crickets and the rustle of leaves. She had come in search of Miss Clara Henshaw, the enigmatic young woman in the crimson gown, whose presence near the pendant's case had been noted by both Mr. Baxter and Mr. Mortimer. Miss Marple's keen eyes had caught sight of her slipping through a side door into the garden, her silhouette fleeting against the moonlit lawns, and she sensed that this conversation might unravel a crucial thread in the mystery of the stolen emerald. Miss Henshaw stood alone by a stone bench, her back to the manor, her gaze fixed on the roses, as if they held answers to unasked questions. The crimson gown, though elegant, showed signs of wear at the hem, a detail that Miss Marple noted with interest, suggesting a life of limited means cloaked in borrowed finery. The young woman's posture was tense, her hands clasped tightly before her, and Miss Marple approached with the gentle tread of one accustomed to coaxing confidences from the wary. "Miss Henshaw," she called softly, her voice carrying the warmth of a trusted friend. "Might I have a word? The garden is lovely tonight, is it not?" Miss Henshaw turned, her wide eyes catching the moonlight, their expression a blend of surprise and caution. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low and slightly breathless, "I didn't expect anyone to find me here." She offered a tentative smile, but it faltered, and Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tightened on the folds of her gown, a gesture that spoke of unease. "I find gardens a fine place for reflection," Miss Marple said, settling onto the bench with a sigh, as if the night's events had wearied her. "But I confess, I sought you out. This business with the pendant has everyone in a tizzy, and I thought you might have seen something, being near the case as you were." Her tone was conversational, but her eyes were sharp, watching for the subtle cues that often revealed more than words. Miss Henshaw's face paled, and she sat beside Miss Marple, her movements hesitant. "I was only a guest," she said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had no reason to take the pendant, if that's what you mean." Her words were defensive, but there was a tremor in them, and Miss Marple sensed a story beneath the surface, waiting to be gently drawn out. "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing. "No one is accusing you, but you were near the table when Thomas stepped away, I believe. He mentioned fetching water for you, such a kind gesture on his part." Her comment was gentle, but it carried a subtle probe, and she watched as Miss Henshaw's hands twisted in her lap. "Yes, I felt faint for a moment," Miss Henshaw said, her eyes dropping to the gravel at her feet. "The room was so warm, and the crowd. I asked Thomas for a glass of water. I didn't think it would cause such trouble." Her voice was soft, almost pleading, and Miss Marple noted the way her shoulders hunched, as if bracing for blame. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of kindly concern. "It's no trouble at all, my dear. These things happen. But tell me, did you notice anyone near the case while Thomas was gone? It was only a moment, but moments can be telling." Her question was posed with the air of a grandmother seeking a simple anecdote, but her gaze was steady, searching for the truth in Miss Henshaw's response. The young woman hesitated, her fingers plucking at the fabric of her gown. "I wasn't really watching," she said at last. "I was distracted. The auction was over and people were moving about. I saw Mr. Baxter talking to some guests, and Mr. Vane was near the podium, but I didn't see anyone touch the case." Her words were halting, and Miss Marple sensed a reluctance, as if she were choosing her words with care to avoid revealing too much. "You have a keen eye, I'm sure," Miss Marple said, her tone encouraging. "And you cut such a striking figure in that gown. You must be a frequent guest at events like these, though I understand you're new to Fernley." Her comment was a gentle invitation designed to draw out Miss Henshaw's story, and she watched as the young woman's expression softened, then tightened again. "I'm not much for grand events," Miss Henshaw admitted, her voice tinged with bitterness. "I'm only here because Lady Harrington is a distant cousin. She invited me out of kindness, I suppose, though I'm hardly in her circle." She paused, her eyes flickering toward the manor, as if it represented a world she could only glimpse. "I've had to make do on my own for some time now." Miss Marple nodded, her face a mask of sympathy. "It can't be easy, my dear, managing alone. I've known young women in St. Mary Mead who've faced similar trials. A broken engagement, perhaps, or a family misfortune." Her question was soft, but it struck a chord, and she saw Miss Henshaw's eyes widen, a flash of pain crossing her face. "How did you—" Miss Henshaw began, then stopped, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Yes, an engagement," she said at last, her voice barely audible. "He was a charming man, or so I thought, promised me the world, then left me with nothing but debts when he ran off. I've been scraping by ever since, taking what invitations I can to keep up appearances." Her words carried a raw honesty, and Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy, tempered by the knowledge that desperation could drive even the honest to desperate acts. "What a trial that must have been," Miss Marple said, her voice warm with understanding. "And yet you carry yourself so well. That gown, for instance, it's quite lovely, though it must be a challenge to maintain such elegance." Her comment was a gentle probe, and she noted the flush that rose to Miss Henshaw's cheeks. "It's borrowed," Miss Henshaw said quickly, her hands smoothing the crimson fabric. "A friend lent it to me for the occasion. I couldn't afford such things otherwise." Her admission was reluctant, and Miss Marple sensed a pride wounded by necessity, a vulnerability that might make the pendant's allure all the more tempting. She shifted the conversation, her tone light but purposeful. "You must have admired the pendant, as we all did. Did you have a chance to see it closely, perhaps when it was displayed?" Her question was another thread, weaving toward the heart of the mystery, and she watched as Miss Henshaw's hands stilled, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's for a fleeting moment. "I saw it from a distance," Miss Henshaw said, her voice steady but guarded. "It was beautiful, of course, but I had no reason to go near it. I was just watching the crowd, trying to fit in." Her words were plausible, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her voice, the way her gaze slid away to the roses, as if seeking refuge in their silent beauty. Miss Marple leaned back, her hands resting lightly on her knitting bag. "You've been most kind to indulge my questions," she said, her smile warm. "It's a puzzling matter, isn't it? A jewel vanishes, and yet no one saw a thing. But people often see more than they realize, don't they?" Her comment was almost musing, but it carried a subtle challenge, and she saw Miss Henshaw's shoulders stiffen. "I've told you all I know," Miss Henshaw said, her voice firm but tinged with unease. "I only wanted a glass of water. I didn't take the pendant." Her eyes met Miss Marple's, and for a moment there was a spark of defiance, quickly masked by a polite smile. "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said, rising from the bench with a gentle sigh. "You've been most helpful. I shall leave you to enjoy the garden's peace." She turned toward the manor, her steps slow and deliberate, her mind racing with the fragments of Miss Henshaw's story. The young woman's poverty and pride were compelling motives, and her presence near the case, coupled with her request to Thomas, suggested a possible opportunity. Yet her fearfulness seemed genuine, as if she were caught in a web not entirely of her own making. As Miss Marple re-entered the manor, the glow of the chandeliers greeted her, along with the restless murmur of the guests. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young governess, driven by desperation, had pilfered a silver spoon, only to be betrayed by her own guilt. Miss Henshaw's story echoed that pattern, but there was a complexity to her demeanor, a strength beneath the fragility that intrigued Miss Marple. Was she a victim of circumstance, or a player in a cunning game? Her thoughts turned to the other suspects, Mr. Vane's nervous pride, Mr. Baxter's financial straits, Mr. Mortimer's guarded expertise. Each had a role in the drama, but Miss Henshaw's quiet presence felt like a shadow cast across the stage, elusive yet significant. Miss Marple resolved to keep her in view, her instincts whispering that the young woman's secret, whatever it was, held a key to the pendant's fate. As she made her way toward the drawing room, her small figure swallowed by the grandeur of Fernley Manor, Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of anticipation. The puzzle was growing clearer, stitch by careful stitch, and she was determined to see it through. Chapter 7. The Steward's Panic. The grand hall of Fernley Manor, though quieter now as the guests dispersed into smaller groups, still hummed with the undercurrent of unease that had followed the emerald pendant's disappearance. The chandeliers cast their relentless glow, illuminating the polished oak floor and the side table where the empty case sat, a silent accusation against the evening's festivities. Miss Jane Marple, her lace shawl drawn about her shoulders, moved unobtrusively through the thinning crowd, her knitting bag a familiar weight at her side. Her conversations with Mr. Vane, Mr. Baxter, Mr. Mortimer, and Miss Henshaw had woven a delicate web of clues, each suspect offering a glimpse of truth laced with evasion. Now her attention turned to Thomas, the young steward whose brief absence had provided the thief's window of opportunity. She found him in a small antechamber off the hall, a narrow room used for storing linens and silver, where he sat on a wooden chair, his lanky frame hunched and his face pale with distress. The antechamber was dimly lit, a single oil lamp casting a feeble glow over the shelves of folded tablecloths and gleaming cutlery. Thomas's hands twisted together in his lap, his knuckles white, and his eyes darted toward the door as Miss Marple entered, as if he feared further reproach. She offered a gentle smile, settling onto a stool opposite him, her small figure exuding a calm that seemed to ease the air. "Thomas, my dear boy," she said, her voice soft as a lullaby, "you mustn't let this upset you so. These things happen, and we shall sort it out. But I need you to tell me exactly what occurred when you left the case." Her tone was reassuring, but her eyes were sharp, noting the tremor in his hands and the way his gaze avoided hers. Thomas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I didn't mean for it to happen, ma'am," he said, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and earnestness. "I was watching the case, just as Mr. Vane told me, standing right by the table. But Miss Henshaw, she came up to me, said she felt faint and needed a glass of water. I didn't think it'd be a problem, just stepping away for a moment to fetch it from the refreshment table." His words tumbled out in a rush, and Miss Marple noted the way his shoulders slumped, as if the weight of his mistake pressed heavily upon him. She leaned forward slightly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "And how long were you gone, Thomas? Be precise, if you can." Her question was gentle, but it carried a quiet insistence, and she watched as he furrowed his brow, struggling to recall. "Not more than a minute, ma'am, I swear," he said, his eyes wide with sincerity. "The refreshment table was just across the hall, maybe 20 feet away. I grabbed a glass, filled it from the pitcher, and took it to Miss Henshaw. She was standing near the curtained alcove, looking pale. I handed her the water, and she thanked me, said she'd be all right. I went straight back to the case, but when I checked it, just to be sure, you know, it was empty." His voice broke on the last word, and he buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Miss Marple patted his arm, her touch light but comforting. There, Thomas. You did what you thought was right. But tell me, did you see anyone near the case while you were fetching the water? Even a fleeting glance?" Her question was another delicate probe, and she watched as he lifted his head, his expression tormented by the effort to remember. He shook his head, his eyes brimming with frustration. "I didn't, ma'am. The hall was full of people, moving about, talking. I was focused on getting the water, and it all happened so fast. I didn't see anyone by the table, but I should have stayed put." His voice was heavy with self-reproach, and Miss Marple noted the genuineness of his regret, though she knew that guilt could mask as easily as it revealed. She tilted her head, her expression one of kindly concern. "You mentioned Miss Henshaw was near the alcove. Did she stay there after you gave her the water, or did she move elsewhere?" Her question was posed with the air of a casual inquiry, but she was alert for any detail that might connect Miss Henshaw's actions to the theft. Thomas frowned, his brow creasing as he tried to piece together the moment. "She stayed by the alcove, I think," he said slowly. She took the glass and sipped it, then turned toward the window, like she was looking out at the garden. "I didn't watch her long. I was hurrying back to the case, but she didn't come near the table, I'm sure of that." His words were earnest, but Miss Marple noted the slight uncertainty in his tone, as if he doubted his own recollection. She nodded, her smile encouraging. "You've done well to recall so much, Thomas. And the case itself, did you notice anything unusual about it when you returned? Any sign that it had been touched?" Her question shifted focus to the physical evidence, and she watched as his eyes widened, as if the thought had not occurred to him. He shook his head, his hands twisting again. "No, ma'am. It looked just as I'd left it, closed and locked. I only opened it because Mr. Vane told me to check it now and then, to be sure. That's when I saw it was empty." His voice trembled, and Miss Marple sensed the depth of his fear, not just of blame, but of the consequences that might follow. She leaned back, her hands smoothing the folds of her shawl. "It's a curious thing, isn't it, Thomas? A locked case, a single key, and yet the pendant vanishes. Did you see Mr. Vane or Mr. Mortimer near the table at any point, perhaps before or after the auction?" Her question was another thread in her growing tapestry, and she watched as Thomas's face registered a flicker of thought. "Mr. Vane was at the podium most of the time," he said, his voice steadier now. "He came over once, before the bidding started, to check the case, but that was when I was there. Mr. Mortimer was around earlier in the day, looking at the pendant, but I didn't see him near the table during the auction. He was seated up front, watching the bids." His words were clear, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted to the side, as if recalling a detail he was unsure whether to share. "And Mr. Baxter?" she prompted gently. "He was the winning bidder after all. Did he approach the case at any point?" Her question was a final probe, testing Thomas's observations of the man whose stake in the pendant was most obvious. Thomas shook his head, his expression firm. "No, ma'am. Mr. Baxter was with a group of people after the auction, laughing and talking. He didn't come near the table, not that I saw." His words carried conviction, and Miss Marple filed them away, noting the consistency with Mr. Baxter's own account, though she wondered if his boisterous presence might have served as a distraction. She rose from the stool, her movements slow and deliberate, her smile warm. "You've been most helpful, Thomas. Try not to worry. We shall find the truth of this matter." She patted his arm again, her touch a small gesture of reassurance, though her mind was already racing with the implications of his story. Thomas's brief absence, prompted by Miss Henshaw's request, had created the perfect moment for the theft, but his panic seemed genuine, his distress too raw to be entirely feigned. Yet she knew from experience that innocence could be a mask, and she would not dismiss him yet. As she stepped back into the grand hall, the murmur of the guests greeted her, their voices now tinged with weariness as the night wore on. She paused by the side table, her eyes lingering on the empty case, its brass lock gleaming mockingly in the chandelier's light. The alcove nearby, with its heavy damask curtain, drew her attention, and she recalled the spilled champagne flute she had noticed earlier, a detail that suggested a hasty presence. Thomas's account had confirmed Miss Henshaw's role in drawing him away, but it also raised questions about the timing and precision of the theft. Someone had acted swiftly, with knowledge of the case and the crowd's distractions, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Mr. Mortimer, whose expertise and access made him a figure of growing interest. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a young footman, overwhelmed by guilt, had confessed to a theft he had not committed, driven by fear of suspicion. Thomas's panic echoed that incident, but his story held no obvious contradictions, only the gaps of a moment unwatched. Miss Marple's instincts whispered that the truth lay in those gaps, in the fleeting seconds when the hall's attention had been elsewhere. As she made her way toward the drawing room, her small figure swallowed by the grandeur of Fernley Manor, she felt the puzzle tightening, its pieces beginning to align. The next step, she knew, was to examine the case itself, to seek the subtle clues that might reveal the thief's hand. With a quiet resolve, she moved forward, her mind as sharp as the needles in her knitting bag, ready to unravel the next thread in the mystery of the stolen emerald. Chapter 8. The Clue in the Case. The grand hall of Fernley Manor, though still aglow with the soft radiance of its chandeliers, had settled into a quieter rhythm, the initial shock of the emerald pendant's theft giving way to a restless murmur among the remaining guests. The side table, where the empty mahogany case sat like a mute witness, drew curious glances, but the crowd kept a respectful distance, as if the absence of the jewel cast a shadow too heavy to approach. Miss Jane Marple, her lace shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, stood near the table, her small figure almost invisible amidst the grandeur of the room. Her knitting bag rested at her feet, a silent companion to her thoughts, which darted and wove with the precision of a shuttle through a loom. The conversations with Mr. Vane, Mr. Baxter, Mr. Mortimer, and Miss Henshaw had each added a thread to her pattern. But the case itself, she sensed, held a clue that might bring clarity to the tangled mystery. With Lady Harrington's permission, she had requested to examine it closely, and now, as the butler, Hawkins, stood watchfully nearby, she prepared to unravel its secrets. The case was a handsome piece, its polished wood gleaming under the light, its brass lock a testament to understated craftsmanship. Miss Marple, her movements deliberate, produced a small magnifying glass from her bag, a gift from her nephew Raymond, who knew her penchant for noticing what others overlooked. She leaned over the case, her eyes sharp behind the lens, and studied its exterior. The lock was intact, as Mr. Vane and Mr. Mortimer had insisted, with no visible scratches or dents to suggest forced entry. The hinges, too, were pristine, their pins firmly in place. Yet something about the case's stillness felt deceptive, as if it guarded its story with the same reticence as the suspects she had questioned. She opened the case, its lid gliding smoothly on well-oiled hinges, and peered at the velvet lining within. The deep blue fabric, soft as a midnight sky, bore the faint indentation where the pendant had rested, a ghostly outline of the missing jewel. Miss Marple's magnifying glass hovered over the lining, and her breath caught as she noticed a tiny irregularity, a faint scratch, no wider than a hair, near the edge of the indentation. It was barely visible, the kind of mark that might escape an untrained eye, but to Miss Marple it was as telling as a shout in a silent room. The scratch suggested a careful hand, one that had removed the pendant with precision rather than haste, perhaps using a tool to lift it without disturbing the lock. She straightened, her lips pursed thoughtfully, and turned her attention to the table itself. Its position, near the heavy damask curtain of the alcove, offered a fleeting shield for a thief, a moment of concealment amidst the crowd's distractions. She stepped to the alcove, parting the curtain with a gentle hand, and examined the space within. The spilled champagne flute she had noted earlier still lay on the floor, its contents now dried into a faint stain on the polished wood. The flute's presence was a curious detail, suggesting someone had stood here, perhaps in a hurry, and Miss Marple wondered if the spill had been accidental or a deliberate distraction. She returned to the case, her mind tracing the sequence of events. Thomas had stepped away to fetch water for Miss Henshaw, leaving the case unattended for a mere minute. Mr. Vane had been at the podium, Mr. Baxter among his admirers, and Mr. Mortimer seated near the front, or so they claimed. Miss Henshaw had lingered by the alcove, her faintness a convenient excuse. The scratch in the case pointed to a practiced hand, someone familiar with its design, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Mr. Mortimer, who had provided the case and inspected the pendant beforehand. Yet she could not dismiss Miss Henshaw's role in drawing Thomas away, nor Mr. Baxter's financial motives, nor even Mr. Vane's nervous pride. She glanced at Hawkins, the butler, who stood with the stoic patience of one, accustomed to serving without question. "Mr. Hawkins," she said, her voice soft but clear, Did you happen to see anyone near this table during the auction's close? Perhaps someone who lingered by the alcove?" Her question was posed with the air of a casual inquiry, but her eyes were alert for his response. Hawkins, his face a mask of professional reserve, considered for a moment. "The hall was crowded, ma'am," he said, his voice low and measured. "I was overseeing the footman, ensuring the guests were attended to. I recall Miss Henshaw standing near the alcove, looking unwell, and Thomas fetching her water, but I didn't see anyone approach the case directly. My attention was elsewhere." His words were precise, but Miss Marple noted the slight hesitation, as if he were sifting his memory for accuracy. She nodded, her smile encouraging. "Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. It's often the smallest details that matter." She turned back to the case, her magnifying glass tracing the lock once more. The absence of tampering suggested a duplicate key or an intimate knowledge of the mechanism, and she recalled Mr. Mortimer's guarded demeanor, his claim of crafting the case himself. A jeweler of his skill would know how to manipulate such a lock, perhaps even design it with a hidden flaw. Yet Miss Henshaw's timely faintness and Thomas's absence could not be ignored, nor could Mr. Baxter's desperation to maintain his status. Miss Marple stepped back, her hands smoothing her shawl as she considered the scene. The scratch in the case was a whisper of evidence, a clue that pointed to care and calculation rather than opportunism. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen locket had been taken from a locked box, the thief using a wax impression to craft a duplicate key. The precision here felt similar, and she wondered if Mr. Mortimer's notebook, with its meticulous sketches, might hold a diagram of the case's lock, a blueprint for its betrayal. She turned to Lady Harrington, who had approached quietly, her face drawn with worry. "Jane, have you found anything?" she asked, her voice low to avoid the ears of nearby guests. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained serene. "A small thing, perhaps," she said, gesturing to the case. "A scratch inside, so faint it's nearly invisible. It suggests the pendant was removed with care, not force. Whoever took it knew what they were doing." Her words were measured, but Lady Harrington's eyes widened, grasping the implication. "You think it was someone who knew the case well?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Mortimer, perhaps. He designed it, after all." Miss Marple inclined her head, her smile non-committal. "It's too soon to say, my dear, but the clue is there, and we must follow where it leads." She paused, her gaze drifting to the alcove. "The spilled flute, too, is curious. Someone was there, in a hurry, perhaps. We must consider all possibilities." Her voice was calm, but her mind was racing, piecing together the fragments of the evening's drama. Lady Harrington nodded, her trust in Miss Marple unwavering. "What do you suggest next, Jane? The guests are growing restless, and I fear the scandal will spread." Her voice carried a note of desperation, and Miss Marple patted her hand reassuringly. "We shall proceed discreetly," she said. "I'd like to speak with Thomas again, to confirm his story, and perhaps have a closer look at Mr. Mortimer's notebook, if you can arrange it. The smallest details often tell the largest stories." Her words were gentle, but her resolve was firm, and Lady Harrington agreed, promising to secure the notebook without arousing suspicion. As Miss Marple moved toward the drawing room, her small figure swallowed by the hall's grandeur, she felt the puzzle tightening, its threads drawing closer together. The scratch in the case was a silent witness, pointing to a thief with skill and forethought. Mr. Mortimer's expertise made him a prime candidate, but Miss Henshaw's calculated faintness and Mr. Baxter's financial straits could not be dismissed. Even Thomas, with his raw panic, might know more than he had revealed. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to a village theft years ago, where a single overlooked detail, a smudge of wax on a key, had unraveled a clever scheme. Here, too, she sensed the truth lay in the overlooked, and she was determined to find it, stitch by careful stitch, as she wove her way toward the heart of the mystery. Chapter 9. A pattern emerges. The drawing room of Fernley Manor, with its high ceilings and gilded cornices, was a haven of elegance, yet the air within was thick with the unease that had settled over the guests since the emerald pendant's disappearance. The soft glow of lamps reflected off polished furniture, and the murmur of conversation had softened into a restless hum, as if the scandal of the theft had sapped the evening's earlier gaiety. Miss Jane Marple sat in a corner, her small figure tucked into a velvet-upholstered chair, her knitting bag at her side like a silent confidant. A cup of Earl Grey rested on the table before her, its steam curling upward, but her attention was not on the tea. Her bright, bird-like eyes scanned the room, noting the subtle shifts in posture and glance among the guests, each a thread in the intricate tapestry she was weaving. The conversations with Mr. Vane, Mr. Baxter, Mr. Mortimer, Miss Henshaw, and Thomas had each offered a piece of the puzzle, and the faint scratch in the pendant's case had sharpened her focus. Now, over tea with Lady Harrington, she began to draw those threads together, her mind alert for the pattern that would reveal the thief. Lady Harrington, her sapphire gown slightly creased from the night's strain, joined Miss Marple at the table, her face a mask of controlled anxiety. "Jane, you must tell me what you've found," she said, her voice low to avoid the ears of a nearby cluster of guests. "The whispers are growing louder, and I fear for the hospital's reputation. Have you made any progress?" Her eyes searched Miss Marple's face, seeking reassurance in the midst of her distress. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene, but her mind racing. "A little, my dear," she said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "The case has given us a clue, a scratch, ever so faint, suggesting the pendant was removed with care, not haste. It points to someone with skill, perhaps even familiarity with the case's design." She paused, letting her words settle, and noted the way Lady Harrington's fingers tightened on her fan, a sign of her growing unease. "You suspect Mr. Mortimer, then?" Lady Harrington asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He crafted the case, after all, and the pendant. He would know its workings better than anyone." Her tone was tentative, as if reluctant to accuse a man of such standing, but Miss Marple's smile was non-committal, her thoughts guarded. "It's one possibility," she said, setting her cup down with a delicate clink. "But we mustn't leap to conclusions. People are rarely what they seem, you know, and motives are often hidden in the smallest details." She leaned back, her hands folded in her lap, and her mind drifted to a similar theft in St. Mary Mead, where a trusted shopkeeper had swapped a valuable brooch for a paste replica, his genial manner masking a calculated deceit. The memory sharpened her focus, and she turned her attention to the suspects, weighing their words and actions against the clue of the scratched case. "Let us consider Mr. Vane first," she said, her voice musing. "He's a man of pride, isn't he? So careful of his reputation, always adjusting those cufflinks as if to remind himself of his status. He insists he locked the case and handed the key to Thomas, but his nervousness suggests he fears blame, perhaps more than he should. A man like that might steal to protect his standing, but I think it unlikely. He values his name too much to risk it. Her words were measured, and she noted Lady Harrington's nod, her friend following the thread of her reasoning. "And Mr. Baxter?" Lady Harrington prompted, her eyes narrowing. "He bids so fiercely for the pendant, but I've heard his fortunes are not what they were. Could he have taken it, perhaps to avoid paying?" Her question was sharp, and Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully. "Mr. Baxter is a possibility," she said. "His bluster hides a man under pressure, factories failing, a need to maintain appearances. The pendant was a public triumph, but if he couldn't afford it, he might have seen a way to claim its value without parting with his money. Yet his focus was on the bidding, not the case, and he seemed genuinely outraged by the theft. I wonder if his anger is more about pride than loss." She paused, her eyes drifting to the drawing room, where Mr. Baxter's broad figure was visible, his voice carrying as he recounted his grievances to a sympathetic listener. Miss Marple's gaze returned to Lady Harrington. "Then there's Miss Henshaw, such a quiet young woman, but with a story that tugs at the heart. A broken engagement, a life of scraping by. She has the motive of desperation, and her request for water drew Thomas away at the critical moment. Yet her fearfulness seems genuine, as if she's caught in something larger than herself. I don't think she's our thief, but she knows more than she's said." Her voice was soft, but her words carried weight, and Lady Harrington's eyes widened, grasping the implication. "And Mr. Mortimer," Miss Marple continued, her tone thoughtful. "He's the most intriguing, isn't he? A jeweler of his skill would know how to open a case without leaving a trace, and that scratch suggests a practiced hand. He donated the pendant, but I sensed reluctance in his manner, as if it cost him more than he let on. His notebook, too, those sketches are meticulous, and I wonder if they include more than just designs." She paused, her eyes twinkling with a quiet excitement, and Lady Harrington leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "You think the notebook holds a clue?" she asked, her voice hushed. "I can arrange for you to see it, Jane. He left it in the study earlier, and Hawkins can fetch it discreetly." Her offer was eager, and Miss Marple nodded, her smile warm but purposeful. "That would be most helpful, my dear," she said. "A man like Mr. Mortimer keeps records for a reason, and they may tell us more than he intends." She sipped her tea again, her mind racing through the possibilities. The scratch in the case pointed to a thief with skill, but the timing, Thomas's absence, Miss Henshaw's faintness, suggested a plan that relied on the crowd's distractions. She recalled a conversation with her nephew, Raymond, who had once described the growing trade in synthetic gems, stones so flawless they could fool even an expert. The thought lingered, and she wondered if Mr. Mortimer's expertise might extend to such deceptions. Lady Harrington's voice broke into her thoughts. "Jane, do you think it could be a conspiracy? More than one of them working together?" Her question was tentative, but it reflected the complexity of the puzzle, and Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with appreciation. "It's possible," she said. "People often act alone, but they can be drawn into schemes by circumstance or coercion. Miss Henshaw, for instance, her poverty might make her vulnerable to manipulation. Or Mr. Vane, whose pride could blind him to a partner's deceit. We must keep an open mind." Her words were calm, but her mind was alight with the pattern taking shape, a delicate balance of motive, opportunity, and skill. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a postmistress who stole a necklace, thinking no one would notice a swap with a cheap replica. She was clever, but her mistake was in underestimating the curiosity of her neighbors. Here, too, I think the thief has underestimated us. The scratch, the spilled flute, the timing, they all point to a plan, but plans leave traces. Her words carried a quiet confidence, and Lady Harrington's face brightened, her trust in Miss Marple unwavering. "What shall we do next, Jane?" she asked, her voice eager. "The guests are growing impatient, and I fear the constable will be called if we don't resolve this soon." Her concern was palpable, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch a gesture of reassurance. "We shall proceed carefully," she said. "The notebook first, and then perhaps another word with Thomas or Miss Henshaw. The truth is close, my dear. I can feel it." Her smile was serene, but her mind was a whirl of connections, each suspect's story a stitch in the fabric of the mystery. Mr. Mortimer's expertise, Miss Henshaw's desperation, Mr. Baxter's pride, Mr. Vane's nerves, Thomas's panic. They formed a pattern, and the scratch in the case was its center, a clue that pointed to a thief with both skill and foresight. As Lady Harrington rose to summon Hawkins, Miss Marple remained in her chair, her eyes drifting to the drawing-room's bustling scene. The guests' whispers had grown bolder, their glances more accusing, and she knew the scandal would soon spill beyond Fernley Manor if the pendant was not found. Yet she felt a quiet thrill, the same she had known in St. Mary Mead when a puzzle began to yield its secrets. The emerald pendant was more than a stolen jewel. It was a mirror reflecting the hidden desires of those who had coveted it. With the notebook in hand, she hoped to find the next clue, a step closer to the truth that lay just beyond her reach. Chapter 10. The Jeweler's Notebook. The study of Fernley Manor, with its dark paneled walls and the faint aroma of old leather and ink, seemed to close in around Miss Jane Marple as she sat at the mahogany desk, her small figure illuminated by the soft glow of a single lamp. The room was a sanctuary of quiet amidst the restless murmur of the drawing-room, where the guests' whispers of scandal grew ever more insistent. Her knitting bag rested at her feet, a familiar anchor, but her attention was fixed on the leather-bound notebook before her, its pages a testament to Mr. Felix Mortimer's meticulous craft. Lady Harrington, true to her word, had arranged for the butler, Hawkins, to retrieve the notebook discreetly from where Mr. Mortimer had left it earlier, and now Miss Marple held it in her hands, her fingers tracing its worn edges with the reverence of one who knew that secrets often hid in the smallest details. The scratch in the pendant's case had pointed to a thief with skill and forethought, and she suspected that this notebook might hold the key to unraveling the mystery of the stolen emerald. The notebook was a work of precision, its pages filled with intricate sketches of jewels, rings, brooches, and pendants, each accompanied by notes in Mr. Mortimer's angular script. Miss Marple's bright eyes scanned the drawings, her magnifying glass hovering over the fine lines, noting the care with which each piece was rendered. The sketches were not merely artistic, they were technical, detailing the cut of stones, the weight of metals, and the mechanisms of settings. She turned the pages slowly, her mind alert for anything that might connect to the pendant or its case, her thoughts drifting to a case in St. Mary Mead, where a gardener's ledger had revealed a theft through a single misplaced entry. Halfway through the notebook, she paused at a sketch that bore a striking resemblance to the stolen pendant, a white gold setting with a filigree pattern, cradling a single large gem. The accompanying notes described an emerald, sourced from Amsterdam, 12 carats, exceptional clarity, matching Mr. Mortimer's account of the pendant's creation. Yet something about the sketch caught her attention. A faint annotation in the margin, written in a hurried hand, read, "Synthetic Trial." The phrase sent a shiver of recognition through her, recalling a conversation with her nephew Raymond about the growing trade in artificial gems, stones crafted to mimic their natural counterparts, indistinguishable to all but the most trained eye. Could Mr. Mortimer, a jeweler of such repute, have dabbled in such deceptions? She turned the page, her fingers steady but her heart quickening, and found another sketch of the pendant's case, its lock detailed with a precision that bordered on obsession. The diagram noted the lock's mechanism, a simple tumbler system, reliable but not impervious, and included a curious addendum. Secondary key, workshop. Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully. A secondary key would explain the absence of tampering on the case, allowing a thief to open it with ease. Mr. Mortimer, as the case's designer, would have both the means and the opportunity to craft such a key, and the notebook's evidence suggested a plan far more calculated than a spur-of-the-moment theft. She leaned back, her magnifying glass resting on the desk, and let her mind weave the threads together. The scratch in the case, the spilled champagne flute in the alcove, Miss Henshaw's timely faintness, Thomas's brief absence, all pointed to a scheme that relied on precision and distraction. Mr. Mortimer's expertise made him the most likely candidate to execute such a plan, but his motive remained elusive. Why steal a pendant he had donated, risking his reputation for a jewel he could presumably replace? The reference to a synthetic trial offered a tantalizing possibility. A swap, the real emerald replaced with a fake, allowing him to retain the valuable stone while deflecting suspicion. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the creak of the study door, and Lady Harrington entered, her face pale but composed. "Jane, have you found anything?" she asked, her voice hushed, as if the very walls might carry her words to prying ears. She glanced at the notebook, her eyes widening at the sight of the open pages. "Is that Mr. Mortimer's? Does it tell us anything?" Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene, but her eyes alight with purpose. "It tells us a great deal, my dear," she said, her voice soft but firm. "There's a sketch of the pendant and a note about a synthetic emerald, a stone crafted to look like the real thing. And here, a diagram of the case's lock, with mention of a secondary key. It suggests a plan, one that required both skill and foresight." Her words were measured, but Lady Harrington gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "You think Mr. Mortimer swapped the pendant for a fake?" she asked, her voice trembling with the weight of the accusation. "But why? He donated it himself. Surely he wouldn't risk such a scandal." Her eyes searched Miss Marple's face, seeking reassurance, but Miss Marple's expression remained calm, her thoughts guarded. "It's a possibility we must consider," she said. "A synthetic stone would be worthless to most, but the real emerald could fetch a fortune in the right hands. Mr. Mortimer's notebook also mentions recent sales to a private buyer in London, which may bear investigating." She tapped the page, her finger resting on the final entry, a cryptic note. LDN contact, 10K, delivery post-auction. The sum was staggering, and Miss Marple's mind raced with the implications. A planned sale, perhaps, with the theft as a cover to retain the real jewel. Lady Harrington sank into a chair, her face drawn. "It's dreadful, Jane. To think someone we trusted could do such a thing. What do we do next?" Her voice carried a mix of fear and determination, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch a gesture of quiet strength. "We must proceed carefully," she said. "The notebook is a clue, but not proof. We need to confirm the existence of a synthetic stone and perhaps learn more about this London buyer. I'd also like to speak with Miss Henshaw again. Her role in drawing Thomas away is too convenient to ignore." Her voice was calm, but her mind was a whirl of connections, each suspect's story a thread in the pattern she was weaving. Lady Harrington nodded, her resolve bolstered by Miss Marple's confidence. "I'll have Hawkins keep an eye on Mr. Mortimer," she said, "and I can arrange for you to speak with Miss Henshaw privately. She's been so quiet since the theft. I thought it was just nerves, but now I wonder." Her words trailed off, and Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling with the thrill of the chase. "You've been most helpful, my dear," she said, "and don't despair. The truth has a way of coming to light, like a knot that unravels with a gentle tug." She closed the notebook, her fingers lingering on its cover, and rose from the desk, her small figure moving with a grace that belied her age. As she stepped into the corridor, the murmur of the drawing room reached her, a reminder of the guests' growing impatience and the scandal that loomed over Fernley Manor. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to a case in St. Mary Mead, where a village jeweler had been caught selling counterfeit pearls, his meticulous records betraying his scheme. Mr. Mortimer's notebook echoed that pattern, its details a map to his intentions. Yet she could not dismiss the other suspects. Miss Henshaw's desperation, Mr. Baxter's financial straits, Mr. Vane's nervous pride, Thomas's panic. Each played a role, but the notebook pointed most strongly to Mr. Mortimer, his expertise and access aligning with the scratch in the case and the possibility of a synthetic swap. As she made her way toward the drawing room, her steps soft but purposeful, Miss Marple felt the puzzle tightening, its pieces falling into place. The notebook was a window into the thief's mind, but the final proof lay in confronting the truth, and she knew the next conversation would bring her closer to that moment. With a quiet resolve, she prepared to face Miss Henshaw again, her instincts whispering that the young woman's secrets, like the emerald itself, were waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 11. The Confrontation. The drawing room of Fernley Manor, though still elegant with its gilded mirrors and plush furnishings, had taken on a charged atmosphere, the guests' murmurs now laced with a restless edge as the mystery of the stolen emerald pendant lingered unresolved. The lamps cast a warm glow, but their light seemed to sharpen the shadows. As Latino, where Miss Jane Marple stood near the fireplace, her small figure unobtrusive, yet commanding in its quiet resolve. Her knitting bag rested at her feet, a silent witness to the intricate puzzle she was unraveling. The scratch in the pendant's case, the spilled champagne flute, Miss Henshaw's timely faintness, Thomas's absence, and most crucially, Mr. Mortimer's notebook with its cryptic notes about a synthetic trial and a London buyer had woven a pattern that pointed to a calculated theft. Now, with Lady Harrington's discreet assistance, Miss Marple had gathered the suspects, Mr. Vane, Mr. Baxter, Mr. Mortimer, Miss Henshaw, and Thomas in the drawing room, ready to test her theory and bring the truth to light. The air was thick with anticipation, and she felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle nearing its resolution, her mind as sharp as the needles tucked in her bag. Miss Marple stood before the assembled group, her lace shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her expression serene, but her eyes bright with purpose. The suspects sat in a semicircle of chairs arranged at Lady Harrington's request, their faces a study in varied emotions. Mr. Vane's nervous adjustment of his cufflinks, Mr. Baxter's barely contained indignation, Mr. Mortimer's guarded stillness, Miss Henshaw's wary reticence, and Thomas's pale anxiety. Lady Harrington stood by the door, her sapphire gown a vivid contrast to her worried expression, while Hawkins, the butler, hovered discreetly in the background, ready to summon the constable if needed. Miss Marple's voice, when she spoke, was calm, but carried the authority of one who had unraveled many a village secret. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her tone as gentle as if addressing a parish meeting. "The disappearance of the emerald pendant has caused us all great distress, but I believe we are close to understanding how it was taken. Let us review the evening's events, shall we?" Her eyes swept the room, noting each suspect's reaction as she recounted the auction's fervor, Mr. Baxter's winning bid, Mr. Vane's locking of the case, Thomas's brief absence, and the empty case discovered moments later. The case was locked, its mechanism untouched, yet the pendant was gone. A faint scratch inside suggests a careful hand, not a hasty one, and this, I think, is where our story begins. Her words were measured, and she saw Mr. Mortimer's fingers tighten on the armrest, a subtle sign of unease. She paced slowly before the fireplace, her small figure commanding the room's attention. "Mr. Vane," she said, turning to the auctioneer, "you assured me the case was locked and the key given to Thomas. Your diligence is commendable, but your nerves suggest a fear of blame. I think you are innocent of theft, but perhaps not of oversight." Mr. Vane's face reddened, his cufflinks forgotten as he opened his mouth to protest. But Miss Marple raised a hand, her gesture gentle but firm. "Mr. Baxter," she continued, her gaze shifting to the industrialist, "your bid was bold, a gesture to bolster your standing despite financial strains. Your anger at the theft is genuine, I believe, for you had much to lose by its loss." Mr. Baxter's shoulders relaxed slightly, but his eyes remained wary, as if sensing the net tightening. She turned to Miss Henshaw, her voice softening. "Miss Henshaw, your request for water drew Thomas away at a critical moment. Your circumstances are trying, and desperation can lead to rash acts, but your fear suggests you were perhaps a pawn in another's game." The young woman's eyes widened, her crimson gown a stark contrast to her pale face, but she remained silent, her hands clasped tightly. Miss Marple's gaze settled on Mr. Mortimer, her expression one of quiet certainty. "Mr. Mortimer, you crafted the pendant and its case, a masterpiece of skill. The scratch inside, the absence of tampering, and your notebook's notes, a synthetic trial, a secondary key, a London buyer, point to a plan. You intended to replace the real emerald with a fake, selling the original for profit." Her voice was steady, each word a stitch in the pattern she had woven, and she saw Mr. Mortimer's face drain of color, his spectacles glinting as he shifted in his seat. The room was silent, the guests beyond the semicircle leaning forward, their whispers stilled. Mr. Mortimer's voice, when he spoke, was sharp, his composure fraying. "This is preposterous, Miss Marple. I donated the pendant out of generosity. I had no reason to steal it." His protest was vehement, but Miss Marple noted the way. His hands clenched, his eyes darting to the notebook on the table before her. She picked up the notebook, opening it to the page with the pendant's sketch and the note about a synthetic trial. "This suggests otherwise," she said, her tone mild but unyielding. "A synthetic emerald, crafted to deceive, could be swapped in a moment of distraction, the real stone spirited away for a private sale. Your notebook mentions a buyer in London, a transaction planned post-auction. The secondary key you noted would have made the swap seamless." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle, and saw Mr. Mortimer's jaw tighten, his protest faltering. Thomas, his voice trembling, broke the silence. "I didn't see anything, ma'am. I only stepped away for a moment." Miss Marple nodded, her smile reassuring. "I believe you, Thomas. Your absence was orchestrated, a distraction to aid the plan." Her gaze returned to Mr. Mortimer, her voice firm. "The alcove's spilled flute suggests haste, Mr. Mortimer, perhaps a moment of nerves as you made the switch during Thomas's absence." Mr. Mortimer rose, his face pale, but his voice defiant. "You have no proof, Miss Marple. A scratch, a note. These are not evidence." His words were sharp, but Miss Marple's calm remained unshaken, her eyes meeting his with quiet resolve. "Proof will come," she said. "The pendant, I suspect, is in your workshop, hidden among your tools. A search will confirm it, and the London buyer may yet reveal their part." Her words were a challenge, and she saw the fight drain from Mr. Mortimer's eyes, his shoulders sagging as the room's silence pressed upon him. Lady Harrington stepped forward, her voice steady despite her distress. "Mr. Mortimer, if this is true, you must confess. The hospital's cause cannot bear this scandal." Her plea was heartfelt, and Miss Marple watched as Mr. Mortimer's resolve crumbled, his hands trembling as he sank back into his chair. I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said at last, his voice low and broken. "The emerald was too valuable to part with. I crafted a replica, planned to sell the original discreetly. When Thomas stepped away, I used the secondary key. It was a moment's work." His confession hung in the air, a final thread in the pattern Miss Marple had woven, and the room erupted in gasps, the guests' murmurs rising to a crescendo. Miss Marple remained still, her expression serene, but her heart alight with the satisfaction of a puzzle solved. The emerald pendant's theft had been a performance, staged with care, but its flaws had been her guide. As Hawkins moved to summon the constable, she felt the quiet thrill of truth revealed, her work in Fernley Manor nearly complete. Chapter 12. The Resolution. The drawing-room of Fernley Manor, though still aglow with the soft light of its lamps, seemed to exhale a collective breath as Mr. Felix Mortimer's confession hung in the air, a final note in the discordant symphony of the evening's events. The guests, gathered in clusters beyond the semicircle of suspects, murmured with a mix of shock and relief, their whispers weaving a tapestry of scandal that would linger in the county's gossip for weeks to come. Miss Jane Marple stood quietly by the fireplace, her small figure a beacon of calm amidst the storm, her lace shawl draped neatly over her shoulders and her knitting bag at her feet. Her bright eyes, sharp as ever, surveyed the room, noting the varied reactions. Mr. Clarence Vane's visible relief, Mr. Roland Baxter's grudging nod, Miss Clara Henshaw's quiet exhale, and young Thomas's wide-eyed astonishment. Lady Harrington, her sapphire gown catching the light, moved to Miss Marple's side, her face a blend of gratitude and lingering distress. The puzzle of the stolen emerald pendant was solved, but its resolution required careful handling to preserve the hospital's cause and Fernley Manor's reputation. Miss Marple's voice, when she spoke, was gentle but firm, carrying the authority of one who had unraveled the knot of deceit. "Mr. Mortimer," she said, her gaze resting on the jeweler, whose angular face was now pale and drawn. "You have done the right thing by confessing. The pendant, I trust, is still in your possession?" Her question was posed with the same quiet certainty that had guided her through the mystery, and she watched as Mr. Mortimer's shoulders slumped further, his spectacles glinting as he nodded. "In my workshop," he said, his voice barely audible, a stark contrast to his earlier defiance. "Hidden in a locked drawer, beneath some tools. The replica was in the case. I swapped it during the moment Thomas was away." His words were a reluctant unraveling, and Miss Marple noted the shame in his eyes, a man undone by his own ambition. Lady Harrington, her composure strained but intact, stepped forward. "We must recover it at once," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Hawkins, please arrange for the constable to accompany Mr. Mortimer to his workshop. Discreetly, if you please. We must avoid further spectacle." The butler nodded, his stoic demeanor unshaken, and moved to the door, his steps silent on the plush carpet. Miss Marple turned to the other suspects, her smile warm but purposeful. "Mr. Vane, your diligence was not at fault, though perhaps a touch more vigilance might serve you in future auctions." Her words were kind, but Mr. Vane's face flushed, his cufflinks forgotten as he nodded, chastened but relieved. "Mr. Baxter," she continued, her gaze shifting to the industrialist, "your passion for the pendant was clear, and I'm pleased you'll have the chance to bid again, should you wish." Mr. Baxter grunted, his indignation softened by the prospect of reclaiming his prize, though Miss Marple suspected his finances would dictate a more cautious bid. To Miss Henshaw, she offered a gentler smile. "My dear, your part in this was unwitting, I believe. Your request for water was used, but not by you." Miss Henshaw's eyes, wide and luminous in the lamplight, filled with gratitude, and she murmured a soft, "Thank you." Her crimson gown a vivid contrast to her pale relief. Thomas, still trembling, received a pat on the arm. "You did your best, Thomas. Trust your instincts next time, and don't be swayed by a moment's distraction." The young steward nodded, his face brightening with the absolution of her words. As Hawkins returned with the constable, a sturdy man with a no-nonsense air, Mr. Mortimer rose, his movements slow, as if the weight of his confession anchored him to the chair. "I'll show you where it is," he said, his voice hollow. The constable nodded, and the two men left the room, followed by a footman to ensure propriety. The guests watched in silence, their curiosity tempered by the gravity of the moment, and Miss Marple felt the tension in the room begin to ease, like a knot gently loosened. Lady Harrington turned to her, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Jane, you've saved us from a dreadful scandal," she said, her voice low but fervent. "The hospital's cause is safe, and I can't thank you enough." She clasped Miss Marple's hands, her warmth a contrast to the cool night air seeping through the windows. Miss Marple smiled, her expression as serene as ever. "It was merely a matter of noticing things, my dear," she said, her tone modest but her eyes twinkling with the satisfaction of a puzzle solved. People are much like my knitting, simple patterns on the surface, but prone to tangles if you don't pay attention. Her words drew a soft laugh from Lady Harrington, who seemed to find solace in their simplicity. The constable returned within the hour, the emerald pendant cradled in a velvet cloth, its deep green facets catching the light with a brilliance that drew gasps from the guests. Mr. Baxter stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with renewed interest, and declared his intent to rebid, though Miss Marple noted the cautious glance he cast toward his wife, who stood nearby, her expression unreadable. Lady Harrington announced that the auction would be reconvened the following evening, with added security to ensure no further mishaps, and the guests murmured their approval, their faith in the event restored. Miss Henshaw approached Miss Marple as the crowd began to disperse, her voice soft but steady. "I thought I'd be blamed," she said, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's with a quiet strength. "Thank you for seeing the truth." Miss Marple patted her hand, her smile warm. "You've a good heart, my dear. Keep it strong, and you'll find your way." The young woman nodded, her crimson gown a bright spot in the fading light, and slipped away into the crowd, her step lighter than before. As the guests drifted toward their carriages, the night air cool and crisp, Miss Marple lingered in the drawing-room, her thoughts turning to St. Mary Mead. The mystery of the emerald pendant had echoed a case from her village, where a baker's apprentice had hidden a stolen ring in a loaf of bread, his guilt betrayed by a crumb on his sleeve. Here, too, the smallest clues, the scratch, the notebook, the spilled flute, had led her to the truth, a reminder that human nature was much the same, whether in a village or a manor. Lady Harrington joined her, her face now radiant with relief. "Will you stay for the new auction, Jane?" she asked, her voice hopeful. "We'd be honored to have you." Miss Marple shook her head, her smile gentle. "I think my work here is done, my dear. St. Mary Mead is calling, and I've a garden that needs tending." She gathered her knitting bag, her small figure moving toward the door, but paused to add, "Do keep an eye on Mr. Baxter's bids. He may need a gentle nudge to stay prudent." Her eyes twinkled, and Lady Harrington laughed, the sound a bright note in the quiet room. As Miss Marple stepped into the night, the stars above Fernley Manor gleaming like tiny jewels, she felt the quiet satisfaction of a task well done. The emerald pendant was restored, the thief unmasked, and the hospital's cause secured. With a final glance at the manor's glowing windows, she made her way to her carriage, her mind already turning to the simple pleasures of home, where new patterns, and perhaps new puzzles, awaited her patient hands.